My name is Nora Ashworth. I'm 34, and most of the people in this hall don't know I exist. They know a designation, a rumor, a set of footprints that seem to show up in two countries the same week but never a face, never a name attached. That's by design. I sat in the back row, no rank visible, no ribbons, just plain fabric and a folder in my lap I hadn't opened. My name wasn't on the printed program. It wasn't whispered ahead of time by anyone filing in around me. Nobody in that room expected it, especially not the man seated in the place of honor near the front, Colonel Walter Ashworth, retired. My father, he hadn't seen me yet. The lights were low, the kind of low that made everyone's face look carved rather than lived in, like statues someone had propped up in dress uniform and told to wait patiently for their turn. I could hear the quiet shuffle of programs being folded and refolded, the low murmur of men and women who all knew each other by call sign long before they knew each other by name. I recognized almost none of them by face. I recognized all of them by the particular stillness they carried, the kind you only learn if you've spent years being told that the wrong word in the wrong room can cost someone their life on the other side of the world. A voice at the podium said 4 words, flat and without ceremony, and the entire front section of officers rose to their feet at once, chairs scraping in unison like a held breath finally let go. My father turned, confused, searching the room the way he used to search a formation for the one soldier out of step. Then his eyes found mine. I watched something move behind his face that I hadn't seen since I was a child. Not recognition exactly, something slower, something that had to travel a long way to arrive. He stood. Not because he understood yet. He stood because everyone around him already had, and standing was the only language he'd ever fully trusted. I'm not going to tell you what that moment meant, not yet. You need to understand what it cost to get there first. My mother's name was Grace. She had a laugh that filled a kitchen the way heat fills a room in winter. You don't notice it arriving, you just notice, at some point, that you're no longer cold. She kept a small radio on the windowsill above the sink and used to sing along to whatever station happened to be playing. Badly, cheerfully, without any concern for whether the notes matched. She was the kind of mother who let me stand on a kitchen chair to stir things I had no business stirring, who never once told me a question was a stupid one to ask. She died of pancreatic cancer when I was 11. It moved fast, faster than the doctors expected, faster than any of us were prepared to grieve. I remember the medications lined up on the counter like little soldiers standing at parade rest. I remember her voice getting quieter before her body did, like she was rationing what was left of it, saving the last of it for something specific. On one of the final nights, when the hospice nurse had stepped out and it was just the two of us in the low lamplight, she pulled me close and taught me to say, to tame the correct way. The vowels, soft nothing clipped or rushed. Say it like you mean to keep it, she told me, her hand cool and light against my cheek, not like you're reporting it to somebody. I didn't understand what she meant until years later. By then she was gone, and so was every trace of softness in our house. My father filled the space she left with structure, the way some men fill grief with motion because stillness is unbearable. Boots by the door, lined up at exact 45-degree angles. Dinner at 1800 hours, no earlier, no later. Lights out at 2100, no negotiation. He wasn't cruel in any way you could point to and name to a stranger. He never raised a hand to either of his children. He raised something else instead, a kind of vanishing. When he was disappointed, his eyes would go somewhere behind themselves, like whatever he was looking at had simply stopped existing to him. I learned early that this was his real punishment, not anger, erasure. I used to wait for him by the hallway at the end of the day, holding a book against my chest, like it was something that could speak for me if I couldn't manage the words myself. A new phrase. A sentence in French I practiced 20 times in the bathroom mirror until it stopped sounding like it belonged to somebody else's mouth. Once, when I was 9, I recited an entire weather report in Italian, pieced together phrase by phrase from a shortwave radio I'd found half broken near the fire station, and taught myself, over 2 patient months, to repair. He didn't look up from his paperwork spread across the kitchen table. "That won't keep you alive in a foxhole," he said, and turned the page. Another time, when I was 14, I handed him an essay I'd written for a regional academic competition on how soldiers and civilians misread each other's intentions across language barriers in active conflict zones. It had taken me 3 weeks and 2 library cards to research properly. He flipped to the first page, scanned it the way you'd scan a menu you'd already decided not to order from. "Does it cover field maneuvers?" "No, sir." He set it back down on the counter, exactly where the mail usually landed, the way you'd set down something you'd already sorted mentally into the recycling. By 12, I'd stopped bringing him things. I kept a dictionary tucked beneath my mattress and taped verb conjugation charts to the inside of my closet door, where he never once had reason to look. I learned Russian from Mr. Dalla Petrov, a groundskeeper at my school who'd served with the Red Army as a young man and missed, more than he ever said outright, having someone to argue idioms with in his own language. I learned Portuguese from Nurse Alves, who used to check in on kids with 2 working parents and an empty house after school, and who never once made me feel strange for asking how to correctly say resilience or forgiveness. Or enough? In that house, silence had a structure of its own, load-bearing and deliberate. It wasn't peace, it was surveillance. The absence of words meant you were being measured against some standard nobody had ever bothered to write down for you, and you would not be told the results until you'd already failed them. My brother Daniel was 3 years younger than me, and from the moment he was old enough to throw a football in a straight, hard line, he became the center of gravity in our house. I want to be fair to him because fairness matters more to me now than it used to. He never asked to be the center of anything. But my father found in Daniel something he recognized immediately, the way you recognize your own reflection in a shop window before you've even registered. It's Glass, a boy who wanted, visibly and uncomplicatedly, the exact things my father valued: discipline, physical courage you could see and measure and clock with a stopwatch, a future in uniform that didn't require translation, footnotes, or explanation to the men my father drank coffee with on Saturday mornings. I watched from the edges of that particular spotlight more times than I can count. There were dinners where the entire conversation orbited Daniel's latest scrimmage, his latest fitness test score, his latest acceptance into some junior leadership program, while I sat 2 feet away, having finished translating an entire chapter of a Russian short story collection that no one at the table thought to ask me about. I want to say I hated him for it. That would be simpler to tell, and simpler stories travel further. But it would be a lie, and I promised myself a long time ago that I wouldn't lie in the telling of this, not even the parts that would be easier if I did. I didn't hate Daniel. I watched him get praised for things I did quieter and, I privately believed, better, and something in me went still the way water goes still right before it freezes. Not calm exactly, suspended. There's a particular kind of loneliness in being the invisible child in a house that still has room to notice someone else. It's not that no one is home. It's that no one is home for you. I didn't know yet that Daniel was drowning in his own way beneath all that attention, that the weight of being chosen can crush a person just as thoroughly in its own slower fashion as the weight of being overlooked. I wouldn't understand that until we were both grown, and both a great deal more honest with each other than our father had ever taught either of us how to be. For most of my childhood, I only understood my side of the room. There was one person who saw me clearly during those years, and I think about her more often than I let myself admit out loud. Mrs. Zaru. Margaret Lynn taught 7th grade language arts at a public middle school that smelled permanently of floor wax and old paper, and somewhere in the 2nd month of the school year, she noticed I was reading a Portuguese grammar textbook tucked inside my desk during what was supposed to be silent reading time. She didn't confiscate it. She didn't report it to the office as off-task behavior. She waited until the bell rang. until the other students had filed out into the hallway noise and asked me quietly where I'd learned to do that. I told her about Nursalves, about Mr. Petrov, about the shortwave radio and the fire station and the closet door covered in verb charts nobody at home had ever seen. She was quiet for a moment, considering me the way adults rarely bothered to. "You don't need someone to see you for you to have value, Nora," she said finally. "But when someone finally does, you won't forget it." She started leaving books on the corner of my desk without comment, never making a production of it in front of the other students. Advanced grammar texts. A worn paperback of Camus in the original French, its margins full of some previous owner's careful pencil notes. A dictionary of regional Arabic dialects that I now understand must have cost her more from her own pocket than a teacher's salary could easily spare. She never asked for them back. She just kept doing it semester after semester, year after year, until I graduated out of her classroom and into a high school where I found no one quite like her again. But I didn't need to find another Mrs. Lynn. She had already given me what I actually needed, which wasn't more books. It was proof, early and durable, that the way I was built wasn't a defect that needed correcting. It was a frequency other people simply hadn't learned to tune to yet. Some of them I was beginning to understand never would. That would have to be all right. The acceptance letter came on a Tuesday in a government envelope, heavy stock, corners already softened from being handled by people who knew how to move paperwork discreetly. A full scholarship through a joint partnership between the Defense Language Institute and an Army ROTC commissioning track. 4 years of intensive language training, a guaranteed commission on graduation, and a service obligation that felt to 17-year-old me less like a debt and more like a door finally swinging open in a wall I'd been quietly chipping at for years, with nothing but a butter knife and stubbornness. It wasn't just an acceptance letter. It was the first external proof I'd ever received that the thing I'd built alone in secret in the margins of a house that had never once had room for me was worth something to somebody wearing a uniform my father actually respected. That same week, my father was hosting a small backyard gathering. Nothing large, just a grill, some folding chairs, 3 of his old unit friends and their wives, to celebrate Daniel's acceptance into West Point. I stood in the kitchen doorway with a plate of hamburger buns I was supposed to be carrying outside and watched my father lift Daniel's acceptance letter off the counter like it was something consecrated, reading portions of it aloud to men who nodded along like it confirmed something they'd always privately suspected about the Ashworth family bloodline. I placed my own letter on the hallway table that night, in the exact spot where he always dropped his keys after work, where he couldn't possibly miss it. I told myself I wasn't hoping for anything. That too was a lie. He came in around 2000 hours, still half in uniform, yard mud drying in the treads of his boots. He saw the envelope, picked it up, scanned the first 2 lines with the flat efficiency of a man reading a supply requisition form. "Guess you'll be up to 10 languages by the time they're through with you," he said, and folded it in half and set it down beside the grocery list like a receipt he had no further use for. No congratulations. No question about what it had cost me to get there. No tutor, no family contact pulled in on my behalf. No name dropped in any of the right offices. Just 4 years of a girl teaching herself in secret because the front door of her own house had never once opened for her the way it opened for her brother. Just a grunt and a glass of water poured at the sink and the television clicking on in the next room a moment later. I didn't cry in front of him. I'd stopped doing that years earlier. It had never once bought me anything worth having. I stood alone in the hallway with my shoes still damp from the walk home and understood finally and completely that the man who had raised me would never once ask what it had cost me to become someone worth writing a letter to. I chose a program 6 states away, far enough to breathe freely for the first time in my life. I told myself that distance was the whole reason. It wasn't the only one, but it was the one I could say out loud. DPLROTC was not gentle, and I was grateful for that in a way I don't think anyone who grew up in a softer house could fully understand. Physical training before sunrise. language immersion blocks that ran 12 hours some days, cycling through dialects until my dreams started arriving in languages I hadn't spoken since childhood. Evaluators who didn't care how many languages you already claimed if you couldn't hold a coherent conversation under simulated stress with someone screaming contradictory instructions in your ear in Farsi while a klaxon blared somewhere behind you. I thrived there in a way that surprised even me, and I think it surprised my instructors more. Between drills and dialect labs, I volunteered to help rewrite outdated field manuals into simplified syntax for use in humanitarian coordination zones, work nobody assigned me and nobody thanked me for, because I'd finally found a place where the work itself was the thanks. I wasn't just translating words anymore. I was learning to translate intention, to hear what a person actually meant beneath what they were technically saying, and to predict, sometimes a full sentence ahead, where tension would break before it did. No one from home called. Not once in 4 years. Not for my commissioning ceremony. Not for my language proficiency awards. Not for the week I spent in the base hospital with a training injury that turned out to be nothing serious but had for a few frightening hours. Looked like it might be. Some nights walking back from the language lab with my arms full of recordings and field notes, I wondered whether my father even pictured me doing anything real at all, or whether I still existed to him only as a folded letter set down beside a grocery list, forgettable by design. I commissioned as a second lieutenant, then moved quickly during military intelligence assignments that required a security clearance most people in my ordinary life would never know I held. By the time I made captain, I was cleared TSSCI, compartmented into a special access program most people, even at my own duty station, didn't know existed, let alone had a name for. My official billet read Strategic Linguistic Support Officer. That was the cover, plain and forgettable enough that people's eyes slid right past it at cocktail parties. In practice, I was rotated through forward-deployed analysis cells and coordination units under the Defense Intelligence Agency, my assignments changing every few months. My actual name appearing on almost nothing that anyone outside the program would ever be permitted to read. I became functionally a shadow with a working vocabulary in 9 languages and a growing understanding of exactly how much of my father's world I had quietly, invisibly outgrown. My first real test came in the Republic of Georgia 18 months into my first overseas rotation, parsing intercepted radio exchanges in Georgian and Farsi between black market weapons negotiators operating along a stretch of contested border road. I spent 3 weeks in a converted shipping office that smelled of diesel and instant coffee headphones clamped over my ears 12 hours a day, learning to tell the difference between a negotiator who was bluffing and one who genuinely didn't know what he was selling. I made a mistake there, early on, that I still think about. I misread a pause, a half-second of hesitation I initially flagged as evasive. That turned out to be nothing more than a man collecting his breath before a difficult admission. It cost us 4 hours of unnecessary caution and, more painfully, cost me a full night of second-guessing every judgment call I'd made up to that point. My supervising officer, a quiet warrant officer named Delgado, found me still awake at 0300 rerunning the audio for the 40th time. "You're allowed to be wrong once," he told me, not unkindly. "You're not allowed to let being wrong once convince you that you were never right to begin with. Those are different problems, Captain, and only one of them will actually get somebody killed." I never forgot that. It became something close to a discipline for me. The difference between doubting a specific judgment and doubting the whole apparatus that produced it. Croatia came next, a shipping port where I spent 4 nights inside a shipping container running on a portable generator, decoding layered metaphor and intercepted communications from a separatist logistics network that spoke almost entirely in agricultural code words for weapons shipments, seed harvest irrigation schedule. Phrases that would mean nothing to an untrained ear and everything to someone who'd spent years learning how frightened, careful people disguise the things they can't say plainly. I built, over those 4 nights, a working glossary that the agency still uses in updated form for that entire region, and then Syria. I was flown in on short notice to support a hostage negotiation involving 5 overlapping dialects and 2 shell logistics companies posing as humanitarian contractors. A tangle of language and motives so dense that the negotiator, already on the ground, a capable but proud man named Colonel Briggs, had been running in circles for the better part of 2 days without realizing it. Briggs didn't want me in the room, not really. He said as much, quietly, the first hour I arrived. I've handled negotiations in 3 countries without a linguist holding my hand, Captain. I'm not here to hold your hand, sir, I said. I'm here because the man on the other end of that line just told you something you don't have the training to hear. He let me stay. I don't think he entirely believed me until the 4th hour, when I caught it. A verb tense shift, small enough that most trained listeners would have let it pass entirely. The other party had switched, mid-sentence, from describing the hostage's location in the present tense to describing it in the past tense. Not where they were being held, where they had been held. They've moved them, I said, cutting across Briggs mid-response. Recently, within the hour, maybe less, based on the verb structure. Whatever coordinates they're about to give you are already stale. Briggs stared at me for a full 3 seconds, long enough that I genuinely thought he might override me and proceed anyway, purely on principle. Then he keyed his radio and redirected the extraction team based on a secondary observation post we'd flagged as a fallback location 2 days earlier. It was the right call. The hostages were exactly where the shifted verb tense had suggested they might be, moved less than 40 minutes before our team arrived. 6 people came home that day who might not have if a single grammatical shift buried in a language most Americans have never heard spoken had gone unnoticed. My name went on the mission brief for that operation, buried 3 pages deep in an annex that almost no one outside the program would ever be cleared to read. But it went on. And somewhere, stateside at a duty station he'd been assigned to straight out of West Point, a young officer named Daniel Ashworth read a heavily redacted summary of an operation he had no idea his own sister had been part of, and felt something he couldn't yet name, pride tangled up with an old, stubborn ache at not being told anything real by anyone in our family ever about anything that actually mattered. I didn't learn that until much later. We were both, it turns out, keeping the exact same kind of silence in 2 different corners of the same war. There's a detail from that mission I've never included in any official account, because it isn't the kind of thing you can put in an annex. After the extraction team confirmed all 6 hostages were secure and moving toward the rally point, I sat down on an overturned crate outside the command tent and found I couldn't stop my hands from shaking. Colonel Briggs found me there 20 minutes later, still sitting, still shaking, a canteen of water untouched in my lap. "First time it's actually landed on you, what almost happened?" he asked, not unkindly, settling onto the crate beside me. "Something like that, sir. You did the math right, Captain. That's the part that matters." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dust settling over the compound. Most people who are good at what you do never let themselves feel it afterward. They think feeling it makes them weaker for the next one. I've watched it burn people out from the inside over 20 years of this work. Don't let it do that to you. I didn't tell him where I'd learned to swallow feeling instead of showing it, or how long I'd been practicing that particular skill. I just nodded, and eventually the shaking stopped, and I flew home 3 days later to an apartment where no one was waiting up, and told no one what it had actually cost me to be right that time. 3 years after Syria, I was pulled into an office I'd never set foot in before. Brigadier General Elena Reyes, Inspector General's office, Sensitive Activities Division. She didn't waste time on pleasantries, and I liked her immediately for it. "There's been a breach," she said without preamble. "Encryption architecture across a legacy communications framework. It compromised at least 1 field operation that we've confirmed. Possibly more we haven't traced yet." She slid a folder across the desk, not electronic, paper, which told me instantly how tightly they wanted this contained. I need someone who can read the linguistic and procedural fingerprints buried in the documentation trail. Someone with the clearance and the discretion to do it quietly. under my direct authorization, outside the standard reporting chain until we understand exactly what we're dealing with. Why me, ma'am? Because you caught a verb tense in Syria that saved 6 lives, Captain Ashworth. I don't hand assignments like this to people who merely read reports. I hand them to people who read what's underneath the reports. She held my eyes for a moment. This is authorized. It's not freelance work, and I need you to understand that distinction clearly before you walk out of this office. Whatever you find, you found it because I sent you looking, under my written authority. Document it that way from the first page. I want to be honest about this part because it matters more than almost anything else in this account. I did not go looking for my father in that folder. I was assigned this, formally, under a legitimate written order, to trace a breach with no named suspect attached to it at all. Whatever I eventually found, I found because General Reyes sent me looking, not because some private grievance sent me hunting for a reason to hurt him. I've had to remind myself of that distinction more than once in the years since, on nights when it would have been easier to believe the uglier version of the story. The breach had a signature of its own, a particular structural laziness in how the encryption lattice handled key rotation. The kind of shortcut that only appears when someone approves a framework without properly stress testing it first. I traced the authorization chain back 6 years to a decommissioned initiative called Horizon Echo. Most of the associated paperwork had long since been archived and quietly forgotten by everyone except the systems that still, silently, depended on it. One name kept surfacing in the technical sign-off logs: Ashworth, Walter, Colonel, retired. Temporary consultancy designation, TS-SCI, compartmented. My hands went still over the keyboard. I'd known vaguely that my father had consulted on Horizon Echo during the transition period before his retirement, the way you know facts about a parent's career without ever having asked for the details, because asking had never once been welcomed in our house. What I hadn't known until that exact moment was that his signature had authorized the precise lattice model that had eventually been exploited. I kept pulling threads. A vendor contract stood out immediately. A shell firm operating out of Northern Virginia, Vera Systems, brought on as a subcontractor for encryption mirroring services. The installation date sat in January. The Syria mission, my mission, began in March. The final implementation sign-off, dated 2 weeks before our deployment, carried my father's signature, time-stamped at 02:13 in the morning. It wasn't proof he'd built a backdoor deliberately, but it wasn't nothing either. I remembered something he'd told me once, years earlier, after I'd forged his signature on a note excusing me from a physical fitness test I'd been genuinely too sick to take. He found out within a week. He made me run laps until I was sick for real in front of the whole squad, and then he stood over me, arms crossed, breathing hard from the effort of watching. A man's name is his oath, he'd said. You don't fake that and expect to walk upright afterward. Now I was staring at his name attached to a document that had nearly gotten 6 people killed on the other side of the world, wondering whether he had ever once believed a single word of what he told me that day. I didn't stop at his signature because something about the pattern kept bothering me late into the night. A consultant with my father's particular brand of caution, the man who lined boots at precise angles and scheduled dinner to the minute, wouldn't normally miss a vulnerability that basic. I pulled Vera Systems' full personnel records and cross-referenced them against retired officer consultancy registrations, and found a name I recognized instantly from old photographs that used to sit on our living room mantel, right beside my mother's. Frank Doyle, retired major. He'd served alongside my father in Kandahar 2 decades earlier, and family legend. The little of it we were ever told held that he pulled my father out of a burning vehicle during an ambush, at real risk to his own life. Doyle was listed as Vera Systems' technical lead, the man who had actually designed the compromised encryption architecture from the ground up. I sat with that discovery for a long time. My father hadn't built the backdoor. He trusted an old friend's word that the framework had already cleared a proper technical review, signed off on a fast-tracked implementation timeline because Doyle told him it had already been vetted and never once verified that claim himself. Negligence, not malice. That distinction wouldn't undo 6 people nearly dying in Syria. But it changed the shape of what I was looking at, not a man who had knowingly sold out his country for money or spite, but a man whose entire operating principle for 40 years trust the chain, trust the uniform, trust the man who served beside you under fire had finally been used against him quietly and completely by someone he had never once thought to question. It didn't make me forgive him, but it kept me from hating him the way I might have if the story in front of me had been simpler than the one the evidence actually told. I remembered Frank Doyle from childhood, vaguely, the way you remember the furniture of your parents' friendships without ever really examining it. He used to come by twice a year, always with a bottle of something my father wasn't supposed to drink, and always with the same booming laugh that filled our quiet house in a way nothing else ever did. Not even my mother's old radio. He called me Little Linguist once, the only adult in my childhood besides Mrs. Lynn who ever acknowledged out loud that I could speak more languages than most of the officers my father served with. I remember feeling, at 10 years old, a confusing warmth toward a man I now understood had spent years quietly building the exact kind of betrayal that would nearly get me killed on the other side of the world. I sat with that contradiction for a long time. It's a particular kind of grief. Discovering that someone who was kind to you as a child was, in the parts of his life you weren't old enough to see, capable of something this calculated. I've come to believe both things can be true about a person at once, and that believing otherwise is just another way of refusing to look closely at anyone at all, including, eventually, myself. I could have taken what I had straight up the ordinary chain of command and let it become someone else's problem to manage. I'd learned enough by then about how findings like this move through large institutions, how some get quietly protected and others get quietly buried, depending entirely on whose name happens to be attached to them. So instead, I requested a private off-the-record consultation with Judge Advocate General's Corps, with a J-Obser I'd worked alongside once before on an unrelated matter and had trusted ever since. Major Priya Nair listened to the entire account without interrupting once, which is rarer in that building, I've since learned, than most people would ever guess. Here's what happens if this moves forward properly, she said when I finally finished. It doesn't go to a criminal court-martial, not on what you've described here. Negligent authorization isn't the same category as intentional compromise, legally speaking, but it absolutely triggers an Army Board of Inquiry. If the board substantiates negligence at this level, your father could face administrative separation proceedings retroactive to his period of consultancy, a corresponding grade reduction affecting his retired pay for the rest of his life, and permanent revocation of any remaining consulting clearance he still holds. That's not nothing, Captain. That's the Army quietly taking his name off every door he still has a key to. And Doyle? Entirely different animal. Nair's expression hardened slightly. If what you found holds up under DCIS review, he's looking at a criminal referral, fraud, very possibly conspiracy, depending on what the financial trail through Vera Systems' other contracts turns up. That's not an inquiry, Captain. That's prosecution. Full stop. I asked her the question I'd been circling around for days, without quite letting myself land on it. What happens to me? I found this partly outside normal reporting channels. You found it because General Reyes ordered you to, under her written authority, Nair said, holding my eyes. Document that clearly from the first line of your report, and you're fully covered. Fail to document it, and you're the one left exposed instead of protected. Write it exactly as it happened, Captain. Don't make yourself smaller in the telling of it just because the target turned out, against every odd, to be your own father. She let that sit for a moment, then leaned back in her chair, her tone softening slightly for the first time since I'd walked in. Can I ask you something off the record, Captain? One officer to another? Yes, ma'am. Do you want him protected, or do you want him held accountable? Because those aren't automatically the same thing, and I've watched people confuse them in this exact chair more times than you'd believe. I thought about it honestly before I answered, because she deserved an honest answer. And so, I realized, did I? I want it to be true, I said finally. Whatever that turns out to mean for him. I spent my whole life watching him decide what was true about me without checking first. I'm not going to do the same thing to him now, even with this. Nair nodded slowly, like I passed some test she hadn't told me I was taking. That's the right answer, Captain. It's also the harder one. Most people who come through that door want a weapon. You're asking for a mirror instead. Hold on to that instinct. It'll serve you a lot longer than the other one would. I wrote the report exactly as it happened. 8 pages, full technical references, timestamp signatures, no accusations beyond precisely what the data itself supported, and not one inference further. I routed it through General Reyes's office under my own name this time because Nair was right. I had nothing left to hide behind a cover identity for. I had simply done the job I'd been assigned to do. Reyes read the entire report in front of me without a word. When she finished, she looked up and said only, "Confirmed, escalating quietly through proper channels starting today. You did this the right way, Captain. That matters a great deal more than you probably realize right now." 2 weeks later, a plain government envelope arrived at my apartment. No letterhead beyond an official seal, no explanation attached anywhere on the page, just a date, a time, and a location. A closed-door recognition ceremony, attendance strictly by invitation, every single attendee pre-cleared into the relevant program before the doors even opened. I wasn't listed anywhere on the printed agenda. Just a small checkbox beside my name marked confirmed in someone else's careful handwriting. I knew immediately what this actually was. The Inspector General's office didn't hold press conferences. They didn't stage dramatic arrests in front of cameras. When they wanted to correct a record that badly needed correcting, they did it quietly in rooms exactly like the one described on that invitation, in front of precisely the people who needed to understand what had actually happened, whether or not it was ever written down anywhere the public could read it. Among the names scheduled for formal recognition that evening, Colonel Walter Ashworth, retired for decades of distinguished service, entirely unaware that the room around him had been carefully arranged for something else altogether. I arrived early, standard dress uniform, no insignia beyond my rank, nothing that would draw a second glance from anyone filing past. They seated me toward the back, several rows behind him, close enough to watch the back of his neck, far enough that he had no reason yet to turn around. He looked older than I remembered from the last photograph I'd seen of him, though his posture was still upright, every crease in his uniform still pressed to a precision that would have satisfied a drill instructor. There was less certainty in it than there used to be, though. I noticed that immediately. The way you notice a familiar building has quietly begun to lean. The ceremony moved through its early names efficiently, polite applause, brief citations read aloud in the flat cadence reserved for formal occasions. Then Brigadier General Reyes herself stepped up to the podium. She didn't open a folder. She looked out over the assembled room the way a judge looks at a courtroom, just before delivering something that isn't going to be gentle, no matter how carefully it's phrased. "This next recognition," she said, her voice carrying easily to every corner of the hall, "is not ceremonial, it's corrective." The air in the room changed. I felt it more than heard it, a stillness settling over rows of people who understood, even before she said another word, that something real was about to happen in front of them. "There is an officer in this program," Reyes continued, "who has spent the better part of a decade doing work most of you in this room will never be cleared to hear about. Under conditions most of you would not have survived, and until very recently without either the recognition or the protection that work has always deserved." I saw my father's hand tighten, almost imperceptibly, around the edge of his printed program. "We need Warden in the room." No drum roll. No further explanation offered. Just those 4 words, spoken plainly into a silent hall. But every senior officer present, who had been read into the relevant program, sat up straighter in their seats, and several of them rose to their feet immediately, chairs scraping in a ragged, overlapping wave. I stood. I stepped out into the aisle. My father turned slowly, the way a man turns when some part of him already suspects what he's about to find and is quietly trying to buy himself one more second before he has to actually see it. His eyes found mine across the width of the hall. Recognition moved across his face, too late to look like pride, too stunned to look like denial. Something caught uncomfortably in the middle. Unfinished. Raw. He stood, not with any flourish, not with any of the composed dignity he usually wore like a second uniform. He stood because he realized, one full beat behind everyone else in that room, that he had become the last person still sitting. I walked past him down the length of the aisle. He didn't speak. He didn't reach for me. And in that particular stillness, the very same kind of stillness he had used against me for 2 full decades of my life, something finally turned itself around and pointed directly back at him. Because silence, in the right hands, isn't absence at all. It's a verdict. I didn't need to say a single word to deliver mine. General Reyes found me afterward in the side corridor away from the main hall, where I'd stepped out to collect myself before I had to face anyone who might ask what had just happened. You held it together in there better than most people. Twice your rank would have, she said, studying my face with the same careful attention she'd used reading my report weeks earlier. I don't know what I was supposed to feel, ma'am. Nobody does, the first time, Reyes said. I've run 6 of these ceremonies over my career. Not one person has ever told me afterward that it felt the way they expected it to. Some people want an apology in that moment and don't get one. Some people get an apology and find out it doesn't fix what they thought it would. She paused. For what it's worth, Captain, I don't think tonight was about him standing up for you. I think it was about every single person in that hall finally being forced to see something they'd been allowed to overlook for a very long time. That's not the same as closure, but it's not nothing either. I thought about that the entire drive home, and for a long time afterward. 3 days passed, no call, no message of any kind. Then, at 2004 in the morning, a flagged file appeared in my secure inbox. No subject line, no sender name attached beyond a routing code I recognized immediately as belonging to him. Just a single document, one line, centered alone on an otherwise blank page. If I sign a confession, will you go public with it? I didn't answer right away. I sat with the question for a long while, the way I'd learned to sit with so many silences before it, turning it slowly over, looking for what was actually underneath the words on the screen. He wasn't asking me about guilt. He already knew, by then, exactly what he was guilty of. He was asking me about control, whether this moment still, somehow, belonged to him to manage, one final time, or whether it had finally, completely, slipped all the way out of his hands for good. At dawn, I wrote back, "No, but I'm not the child who's afraid of the dark anymore, either." He never replied to that message. But a week later, Major Nair told me quietly and off the record that Colonel Walter Ashworth had walked into his board of inquiry, proceeding entirely voluntarily, no summons required, no legal maneuvering, no attorney doing the talking on his behalf. He opened his statement with 7 words. I authorized a contractor I didn't verify. He didn't attempt to shift blame onto Doyle, though by every account he had ample incentive to. He admitted plainly and without qualification that he'd fast-tracked the encryption framework based entirely on an old friend's word, that he'd never reviewed the underlying architecture himself, that he'd let old trust substitute for basic verification because it was easier. Because Doyle had once pulled him bodily out of a burning vehicle in Kandahar, and some part of him had quietly decided, without ever examining the decision, that this debt meant he would never again need to check the man's work. When the board asked whether he knew who had actually uncovered the breach, he paused for a long moment. "No," he said, "but I suspect I owe her everything." He never said my name, but in the official transcript, one line was underlined and flagged by the board's recorder as significant. I accept whatever findings this board reaches. I ask only one thing: keep my daughter's name off the public record. That was the closest he had ever come, in 34 years, to telling me he was sorry. The board's findings came down 8 weeks later. Negligent dereliction in the discharge of a consultancy duty, substantiated in full, a retroactive grade adjustment affecting his retired pay for the remainder of his life, permanent revocation of his consulting clearance, and removal from every advisory registry that had kept his name relevant in defense circles since retirement. The quiet currency he'd spent his last decade slowly accumulating, gone in a single administrative decision. No criminal referral followed. The board found no evidence of deliberate intent, and his complete, voluntary cooperation weighed meaningfully in his favor throughout the proceedings. Frank Doyle did not fare nearly as well. The financial trail through Byra systems, once DCIS investigators began pulling the threads in earnest, revealed the pattern of deliberately compromised architecture sold under at least 2 other shell consultancy names to different clients entirely. He was referred for criminal prosecution on fraud and conspiracy charges. My father testified against him without a single moment of visible hesitation, which I think genuinely surprised almost everyone who had known the two of them for 20 years. Everyone, that is, except me. Loyalty for my father had always meant something narrow and rigid and absolute. But I was beginning to understand it had never once meant loyalty to a lie. Not once he could no longer pretend, even to himself, that it wasn't one. There was no press release, no headline anywhere. Just a quiet, careful dismantling of legacy influence that most of the world would never notice happening at all, and a smaller, far harder reckoning that only the people inside our own family would ever fully understand the true weight of. I visited my father once during that 8-week waiting period, before the findings were finalized, something I hadn't done in almost 3 years. He answered the door in civilian clothes, which felt strange in itself. I don't think I'd seen him out of uniform more than a handful of times in my entire life. The house was quieter than I remembered. Though I suppose most houses are quieter once the person who used to fill them with noise is gone and the person who's left has stopped trying to replace that noise with anything at all. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd once told me an Italian weather report wouldn't save my life in a foxhole. He made coffee neither of us drank. Eventually he said, without looking at me directly, "I used to think being hard on you was the same thing as preparing you. I've had a lot of time lately to sit with how wrong that was." I didn't offer him easy forgiveness. I wasn't ready for that, and I don't think he was asking for it. But I stayed for 2 hours that afternoon, longer than I'd stayed in that house in over a decade, and when I left, he walked me to the door instead of letting me see myself out, which was for him its own quiet kind of apology. Daniel called me 2 weeks after the board's findings became final. We hadn't spoken more than a handful of sentences to each other in nearly a decade. Not out of any dramatic falling out, just the slow, accumulated distance of 2 people raised in the same house who had never once been taught how to talk to one another without our father standing between us as the only subject either of us knew how to discuss. "I read the redacted brief," he said, his voice rougher than I remembered it. "The Syria one. Years ago, actually. I didn't know it was you until Reyes's office called me in for a routine interview about Dad's board proceedings. I didn't say anything right away. I let him keep going. I used to think you had it easier," he said, "getting to leave home the way you did. Getting to be the one nobody expected anything from, so that nothing you ever did could really disappoint him." He stopped talking for a moment. "I know exactly how that sounds now, saying it out loud to you. I spent every single year at West Point terrified that the day I finally slipped, just once, just barely, that would be the day he finally saw who I really was underneath it all. And it would turn out the real me wasn't the son he thought he'd raised. You got left alone, Nora. I got watched every single day of my life, every meal, every report card, every single choice. I'm not saying it was the same experience. I'm saying I don't actually think either one of us ever got a father out of that house. I think we just got 2 completely different versions of the same absence." I sat with that for a long moment. The way I've slowly learned to sit with difficult themes instead of rushing to fill the space around them with easier words. "I didn't know you carried any of that," I said finally, honestly. You couldn't have known, Daniel said. We were never once allowed to say any of it out loud to each other. That was kind of the whole architecture of that house, wasn't it? Everybody keeping score in a language nobody was ever taught to speak. We talked for almost 2 hours after that, longer than we'd spoken to each other in the previous 10 years combined. It didn't fix everything between us. I don't think anything ever fully does, and I've stopped expecting it to. But it was the first genuinely honest conversation either of us had ever had inside our own family, and it turned out we had both been fluent this entire time in the exact same silent language. We simply hadn't known until that phone call that the other one spoke it too. A month after the board's findings closed, a package arrived at my apartment. No return address anywhere on the plain brown paper, my name written across the front in my father's careful, blocky handwriting, the same hand that used to sign permission slips he never once read closely enough to actually understand what he was approving. Inside, resting in a small worn velvet case, was his West Point class ring, and beneath it, folded into a square of cloth, his original commissioning pin, the same one I remembered him wearing every single day of my childhood, through 2 overseas deployments, through my mother's funeral, through every dinner served precisely at 1800 hours, where he never once looked up from his plate long enough to ask what I'd learned that day at school. It was the exact same pin I'd once reached for at 8 years old, standing on my toes at the edge of his dresser, only to have him take it gently but firmly from my hand and say, without looking at me, "This is for soldiers, Nora, not spectators." There was no note inside the box, no explanation, no written apology I could hold on to and reread later on a difficult night. Just cold metal and the accumulated weight of 30 years of memory sitting quiet and heavy in the center of my palm. I thought, standing there in my kitchen, that it would sting the way so much of his silence always had. It didn't. For the first time in my entire life, his silence didn't feel like erasure. It felt like something closer to surrender, not a performance staged for anyone watching, not one more play for control dressed up as sentiment, just an old man finally, quietly putting down the one object he had used for decades to measure who counted as worthy of standing beside him. He had finally seen me, not as the daughter who broke formation by choosing language instead of steel, not as the invisible one, the quiet one, the one who never caused trouble because trouble had always required being noticed first. He saw me, at long last, as someone who had stood directly inside the exact storm he himself had helped create, and hadn't flinched, and hadn't once asked his permission to survive it. I called Mrs. Lynn last spring after finally tracking her down through the school district's retired staff directory. She was 71 by then, still teaching part-time as a volunteer tutor for kids who needed extra language help after regular school hours ended. I told her, as much as my clearance would allow me to say honestly, what all those books quietly left on the corner of my desk had actually become, years later, in a life she'd had no way of predicting. I always wondered, she said, laughing softly on the other end of the line, a sound I remembered clearly from 20 years earlier, whether you'd end up a translator for the United Nations, or some kind of spy in a movie. I suppose I guessed right on both counts at once in my own way. I didn't correct the details. Some things are better left as a story someone gets to enjoy without every hard edge attached to it. These days, when I'm not deployed, I teach 2 evenings a week at the Defense Language Institute, the very same program that once handed a scholarship to a girl nobody at home had ever bothered to congratulate. I look every single class for the students who sit a little apart from the others, who already know more than they're willing to admit out loud in front of their classmates who've learned somewhere along the way. The same way I once did, that being quietly excellent feels safer than being loudly seen, I make a point of seeing them anyway, every time. Last month, a 19-year-old cadet named Priya, no relation to Major Nair, just a coincidence of names that made me smile the first time I read her file, stayed after class to ask hesitantly whether it was normal to feel like she was fluent in a language nobody at home had ever wanted to hear her speak. I recognized the question before she'd even finished asking it. I told her what Mrs. Remington, Lynn told me all those years ago in almost the exact same words, because some truths don't need updating no matter how much time passes between the telling of them. She looked at me like I'd handed her something she hadn't known she was allowed to want. Maybe I had. Daniel and I have dinner together now, once a month, no father present, no old scorekeeping in the room with us. He's stationed close enough that it's easy, and far enough that neither of us has to pretend the distance in our childhood didn't happen. We talk about ordinary things mostly, his daughter's first words, my next rotation, whether either of us will ever manage to explain our actual jobs to people at holiday parties without lying by omission. It's not the relationship either of us was handed growing up. We built this one ourselves, the same slow, deliberate way I built every language I ever taught myself in secret. One patient exchange at a time, with no one standing over either of our shoulders keeping score. My father and I speak twice a year, on his birthday and mine. The conversations are short, careful, still learning their own shape. He asked me last spring, in his blunt way, what language I was working on now. I told him Mandarin, slowly, evenings only, no immersion program this time, just the quiet discipline of it for its own sake. He was silent on the line for a moment. Your mother would have liked that, he said finally. She always said you had her ear for it. It was the first time in my adult life he had ever mentioned my mother's opinion of anything I'd done. I didn't say anything back right away. I let the silence sit between us the way it always had in that house, except this time, for the first time I could remember, it didn't feel like a verdict. It felt like something closer to peace, fragile and unfinished, the kind you have to keep choosing rather than the kind that simply arrives and stays. Because I know now what Mrs. Murchwing, Lynn knew all along, what it took me more than 20 years and one devastating discovery about my own father to finally fully believe for myself. You don't need someone to see you in order to have real value. But when someone finally does, when a room full of strangers rises to their feet because a name spoken quietly at exactly the right moment means far more than any of them ever let on beforehand, you don't forget it. Not for the rest of your life. And somewhere in a hallway that used to feel like the loneliest place in the entire world, a 9-year-old version of me is still standing at the edge of the light, holding a book against her chest, waiting patiently for someone to finally ask her what she learned today. This time, someone finally asks, and this time I get to answer out loud.